It's Daniel James Sharp here, editor of the Freethinker magazine. Today I'm interviewing Professor A.C. Grayling, a philosopher who is the author of many books, most recently Discriminations, Making Peace in the Culture Wars, which we shall be discussing today. So thank you very much for joining me today and giving me some of your precious time.
It's a real pleasure, Daniel. Great to be with you.
So what is the purpose then of this book, Discriminations, and why now?
Well, now, because what people call the woke wars or the culture wars are still raging. Indeed, all the more so because Mr. Trump in America is pushing back against them big time. And indeed, we've just seen, as we speak, a report from Hungary telling us that Mr. Orban is going to ban LGBTQ displays, marches, and this is a very worrying sign, not least because what we're witnessing today in the woke wars is another chapter in what has been a long and, on the whole, pretty successful campaign starting in the first decades of the second half of the 20th century against discrimination. Because what wokeism is about, when you dig into it and look at what's really at issue and what's at stake in it is the fight against discrimination, against racism, sexism, ageism, homophobia, all the ways in which people who, until pretty recently, many of whom had not even the right to lay claim to any rights, are now saying, we want to be part of society, want to be included, we want a fair place in society. We want to be treated according to one overriding identity, and that is as human beings, human individuals. This is a human rights issue. So when we think about the civil rights movement in the US in the 60s and second wave feminism at that time and the gay rights movement, and we think about how overall successful they've been, because they've claimed a lot of the territory that they were absolutely denied beforehand. But of course, they haven't got where we'd like to see them get, which is to that fair and included place in society. So they're still fighting, but the degree to which they've succeeded has really got up the noses of the people who don't want to give up their privileges and their hold on their access to the best things in society. And so now we see a major pushback. So this seems to me to be a time where we should air the issues and we should take note of certain things. One thing we should note, and shut me up, Daniel, if I talk too long, but one thing we should note is that the word woke has been captured by the right, by the conservative side of the debate, and turned into a term of abuse, of mockery. In fact, it's a term that has rather a noble ancestry. As we know, it comes out of the African-American adjuration to itself to be alert, to be awake to the fact that discrimination isn't just the obvious, overt, crude thing of slavery or Jim Crow laws. It's also about all the subtle and hidden ways in which people of color, for example, who go to rent a flat or get a job or put their kids in school or open a bank account, that one way or another, things act against them, that there's a wind blowing against them the whole time. To be alert to it and to call it out and to try to improve things requires being conscious of what's really at issue. And so the term woke, being awake, being alert to these matters, really does matter. The other thing to notice is that on both sides of the debate, so on the side of the wokists on the one hand, on the side of the sort of conservative or right, and certainly the far right, things are done and said by activists, by people on the further wings of both sides of the debate, which sometimes give us pause, and we think about that. But there's no moral equivalence between these two extremes, so these two far sides of the debate. Because on the conservative side of the debate, what you have are neo-Nazis and white supremacists and fascists and homophobes and and misogynists and people who say and do things that are so disgusting and so terrible that when you look at the sorts of things that some people on the woke extreme say, there just isn't any comparison. There's no, as I say, there's no moral equivalence there. So the important thing is to dig into what's at stake. And what is at stake is discrimination, pushing back against discrimination, getting, in fact, an end to discrimination. Because as I say, the absolutely key point is that this is a human rights issue. It's about the rights of individuals to have a fair place, to be included, to have a chance, really, of living lives that feel good to them to live without being always under the oppression of prejudice and disdain and having doors shut in their faces.
So are you woke then? Would you take that label on?
Me, yeah, absolutely, yes, yes. I mean, I'm proud to do it. I think that the word it's a bit like the gay rights movement. You know, when it really got going back in the 1670s. I'm out and proud, you know, as a gay person, is what gay people said. I'm not myself a gay person. In fact, on the contrary, I think it's important to point out that as an old white privileged heterosexual male, you know, I should by that profile be over there on the conservative wing of things. But I mean, all you have to do is just think about it clearly enough and long enough and see, hang on a second, this is an issue about human beings, individual human beings, no matter what they are, man, woman, black, white, gay, straight, it doesn't matter what they are. It's just about human beings. And the minute that you see that, you see through to the fundamentals of the issue, you recognize that in fact that it's just a wrong in society that some groups and the individuals constituting them should be denied the same opportunity, the same place that everybody else has. And then leave it up to them, to their talents, their energy, or whatever it is that they want to make of their lives. But you know, this is the really key and interesting thing about the very idea of human rights. And for me, this is such a valuable concept. I mean, a lot of people think it's sort of old hat to talk about human rights. But if you consider when the UN adopted the Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948, they had right in front of their faces the most horrifying example of what happens when people are denied their rights. I mean, all the horrors and atrocities of the 1930s and 1940s were right there for them to see. And I like to say to people, look, take a piece of paper, tear it in half. From the jagged edge of one half, you can read off the jagged edge of the other half. So all you have to do is just look at the atrocities and horrors of the 1940s, and you'll see what it is we should accord to people just in virtue of their humanity. You know, a right to life, a right to privacy, a right to have an opinion, a right to have a say, a right to be able to assemble or not assemble with others. I mean, all these things are very basic. And what they do is they open up this bit of territory, a bit of terrain around the individual, within which the individual, if they have that energy and talent, can make something of themselves if they want to. No obligation on them to do it. I mean, we might feel on moral grounds that they should, but on other grounds not. So it's in one way it's rather minimal, but in another way it's absolutely fundamental. And it seems to me that the whole issue about discriminations and everything that the activists of the 1960s, the PC warriors, the political correctness warriors of the 1990s, and the woke warriors of today, it's all part of the same story. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to push back against discrimination, get a fair and a just society.
Mm-hmm. I do want to go into that a little bit because the I mean, yeah, the word woke or wokeism to me is I don't really like using it as much because it is such a bogeyman word now. And you know, it's become such that any vaguely liberal or progressive thing is now labeled woke as a term of abuse. But it does strike me that maybe there is something to it in the sense that there is a certain ideology that we might call wokeism, or my preferred term, critical social justice, to borrow from Helen Pluckrose in particular, that is different from liberal social justice, that is an ideology rooted in postmodernist theory and grievance and identity politics, and that does distrust truth and ideas of human rights, even as Western patriarchal constructs, all that sort of thing. Do you not think there is a certain ideology there? There is, or do you think that's just overblown?
No, I mean, I recognize what you're saying there. And the point to make in response is that, of course, all movements of opinion tend to be somewhat broader churches than they appear from the outside. So there will be a number of different ways that people try to theorize or articulate this point. Now, I'm coming at it from a left, liberal, progressive kind of standpoint. And the liberal part of that is slightly paleo-liberal in the sense that I'm thinking very much in terms of kind of Enlightenment values and so on. But and therefore there are plenty of things that I would disagree with when I think about say postmodernists or Marxists. Other things to agree with in them, but plenty of things to disagree with as well. So that I wouldn't adopt wholesale any of the isms with which some people in the broad, as it were, wokist or critical social justice movement would use in order to try to formulate and organize their thinking. So there are different voices here, and there are different perspectives. And of course, the sort of isms that pop up in this debate are, the ways that individuals who are contributing to the debate like to try to get the point across. But I would say that if you rummage in amongst them all, as I've tried to do in this book, and you get down to what's fundamental, the fundamentals are the things that they're generally speaking going to agree on. And what they're going to agree on is this is about, ultimately, it is about fairness, and it's about respect for the rights and claims that people legitimately have in a social situation in which those rights and claims are ignored or denied. And that is the key.
Yeah, I guess I think the important thing for me is always to keep the liberal aspect, as you say, which I think can often get lost um, on the more extreme wings of these sorts of movements.
Well, I think you're right to say that, actually, because I mean, behind the bit of the iceberg underneath the remark that you just made there is that because of the sharpness of some of the edges of the kind of ideological maneuvers that are made on the woke side, you can get a sort of puncturing of certain things that liberals might wish to discuss in a more nuanced way. One of them would be cancelling. Another would be freedom of expression. A third, and they're all related, of course, would be no platforming. And these are sorts of issues which, again, have to be looked at calmly and rationally, understood for what they are, and things said about them which would protect them from becoming self-defeating tropes on the part of people who want to further the cause of social justice. And we can talk about each of those things individually, I think, but I mean, I take it from your remark, and I would certainly agree with the tendency of it, that as the liberal aspect of what we want on the progressive side, we want also to recognize and respect that there are certain kinds of values in social discourse and in the conversation that we have with ourselves in society that should be understood better and respected more and used appropriately, without at the same time wanting at all to yield to the right, which now, of course, positions itself as the great guardian of freedom of expression and the rest of it. Having in the past, of course, been the only ones who ever had it anyway, because they owned the means of expression. But now they're saying, oh, no, you can't, challenge me, because challenging me comes to the same thing as trying to shut me up, and it doesn't and shouldn't. And therefore, we are going to be the great defenders of freedom of expression. If that were the outcome, that would be a terrible goal on the part of the woke causes, because the woke causes precisely need freedom of expression in order to make their case and to issue their challenges against people who deny them the rights that they seek.
Yeah, I think that's an essential point, actually, is because I used to be a lot more concerned with a lot of this stuff on the left, all the woke stuff on the left, and annoyed and het up about it. But I think the past few years we've really seen the alarming resurgence of a very dangerous form of right-wing politics. I don't think I need to go into detail about that. I think it's quite obvious from a glance at the news. And I do worry that ammunition has been given to them, because Elon Musk now claims that X, or Twitter, is the bastion of free speech on the internet. That he's a great free speech champion, when of course he's not.
Oh my God. I mean, it couldn't be more ironic, because I was recently banned from X. I'm the great champion of free speech, so I mean, it's just beyond comical, really. And you can't take these folks seriously, because what they're doing, and again, this speaks to a very key point in this whole debate. What they're doing is they're trying to defend their interests. And their interests are to protect and preserve the position of privilege that they have, and the bigger megaphone. Now, I argue in the book that really this is a very key point, that what we've got here is a conflict between rights and interests. The rights of individuals on the one hand, and the interests of people who are, and historically have had, much greater access to social goods like health and education and opportunity and jobs. That there is a structure through which people can pass if they are already within the structure, so much more easily than people who have historically been on the outside of that structure, or who are on a very low floor. And if you're a member of a club, and you don't want other people to come in because you want to keep all the privileges of that membership, then you're going to be excluding people and discriminating against them for that reason. Now, of course, in a real club, obviously that's fair enough, because the club might exist for a given purpose and not everybody is right for it or whatever. But when the club is society as a whole, it's a different matter. Now, we all have interests, and some of those interests are perfectly legitimate, but interests are not always the same thing as rights. And when there comes to be a clash between interests and rights, and you see people protecting their interests by denying the rights of others, then you have a problem. And that, I think, is where the sort of bruise points are, the trigger points between those who are seeking to assert their claim to a place and those who want to keep them out.
Yeah, again, it strikes me that I might be banging my drum on this a little bit, but the essential thing again is the liberal part of all this, because I think even on the right, I mean, maybe they're quite hard to find these days, but you can be a liberal conservative. That's not a contradiction in terms, necessarily, but so much of the right is now taken over by these, well, essentially fascists, and too much of the left has given them the ground and the ammunition to take issues like free speech, which traditionally are left, liberal, progressive sort of causes, and weaponize them against the left. So I think, yeah, a campaign to bring back a focus on that broadly conceived liberalism is a good thing. And is that then how you make peace in the culture wars, as the subtitle of your book has it?
Well, insofar as the sort of rights agenda, which is very much an Enlightenment achievement in a way, insofar as that is the key issue here, then laying claim to it and pushing it doesn't have to carry with it quite all the other baggage that people associate with liberalism, whether capital L or small l. But it is a very, very central, at least small l principle, and certainly one which is, in my view, very, very well worth protecting. I said earlier that I would describe myself as a left liberal progressive, and I acknowledge what you say, that there have been in the past, and I even know some liberal conservatives. In fact, on occasion, I've actually campaigned alongside some of them on things like digital ID cards and Brexit and things like that. But and I respect them for that aspect of it. But you know, the tectonic plates have shifted, and all the kind of labels that we've used to identify and place people in positions and public policy proposals in the past, liberal, left, right, whatever it might be, they no longer work quite as they did, because given the upsurge of very right-wing thinking and practice in our world, and the number of very right-wing governments there are in the world now, from America to Hungary to Russia to Turkey to India and so on, it's the spectrum is shifted in such a way that these labels don't really do their work anymore. And we have to reconfigure our stand on it. And in order to do that, I think we have to look at what the central issues are that really matter. So, for example, if you think in terms of, let us say, the rule of law, not ruled by law. I mean, Hungary has just passed a law banning LGBTQ marches. So that's ruled by law. The Nuremberg laws were laws, but they're not the rule of law in the sense in which there is an agreed, orderly way of protecting the rights and the interests of people in a society for their benefit. And that kind of aim is an aim which I think, again, on a small l liberal view, is one which is worth fighting for, whatever name, whatever ism, whatever label you want to attach to it. It's a question of positioning. It's a question of where we are in society, working from the individual upwards and from the structures of a constitutional order downwards that meet in a way which is productive and just.
So what do you think then of the... Well, actually, let me take a step back then. Obviously, you're a philosopher. This book is a philosophical perspective on all these issues. What do you think then? Well, what do you think a philosophical look at all this gives us? What value does it have? And what is, a rather grand question, what is the philosopher's role in public life?
All right. Well, two big questions there in a way. Let me answer the first one, the second one, rather briefly. I mean, it seems to me that anybody who's had, the opportunity to spend a lifetime thinking and reading and studying ideas, and ideas are the cogs of history. They're what move things on, what introduce changes or keep things the same or motivate people. And by studying them, one might come up with a few ideas, or at very, very least anyway, want people to be conscious of some of the ideas that are available that might help them with their own thinking. And that therefore, if you put them out there, if you could display them, as it were, put them to work in thinking about contemporary issues, you might thereby make a contribution. I don't think philosophers should be in the business of telling people what to think. They certainly try to teach or help their students learn how to think. But by contributing something, they might just a bit be able to help to enrich the public conversation and in that way do some good. On this particular issue, to go back to your first question there, one of the key things about philosophy is trying to get the question right so that you can see where to look for an answer. And in the case of everything that has happened in the last half century and more, in this great transition that we're living through, at least in the Western world, away from an order of things where slavery was acceptable and actually practiced, for example, where women had a very, very second-class status from the point of view of the kinds of opportunities and privileges held by men. And we're moving away from that. And this is the big, big era of transition. Can't happen overnight. It's been painful and difficult so far, and still is. But when we dig into it and we look at what the question is that's being asked here and where to look for answers to it, we see that the question is about what, just in virtue of being a human being, are my entitlements? Now, once that is answered, and we have, as I say, overwhelming evidence of where the answer is to be found, how are we going to put that to work? How are we going to achieve respect for every individual's human right? Because however utopian, however ideal it sounds to say, in a world in which every individual human being's rights were fully respected, there would be no discrimination. There may not even indeed be any conflict in our world. And that, as I say, could be utopian, could be very idealistic, but it was certainly the dream that Mrs. Roosevelt and her committee had when they drafted the UN Declaration, and which every regime which has adopted and tried to institute codes of human rights, or tried to apply them in international affairs and in national affairs, every organization which has appealed to questions of rights in order to defend individuals and the groups they constitute from one or another kind of harassment or depredation. That is the goal. That is the dream on the horizon that they're working towards. And it applies in this case too. The whole woke issue is an issue about just that matter.
Since you mentioned Mrs. Roosevelt, that just made me think about America, which in some ways is it's the oldest secular democratic republic on earth. It's the first Enlightenment republic. But given everything that's happening now, do you think it's over? Do you think America is done?
Well, I mean, I think it's certainly flaking at the edges and cracking in the middle, big time at the moment. It's sort of tragic to see, but in its way, inevitable, because I'm by a long way not the only person who's written about this already in the past. And in fact, I have another book coming out later in the year, which is on the whole question of the rise of authoritarianism and the way that the liberal democracies of the West, chiefly including the US, but also the UK, are no longer in the form that they're in at the moment, capable of bearing those strains. Here's an analogy. When back in 1792, wherever it was, the Second Amendment was adopted to the Constitution of the United States. This is the infamous, right to bear arms amendment. The arms in question were muzzle-loading muskets, single-shot muzzle-loading muskets, with which you'd have a pretty hard time committing a school massacre. Today, that amendment is defended tooth and nail by the gun lobby in the United States, when incredibly powerful assault weapons are being used to do exactly that, commit massacres in schools. And this is a parable. This is this illustrates the way in which the attempt made by the founders of the US back in the late 18th century to set up a republic which would parlay in some way the consent of the people into good enough government, to use Aristotle's phrase, has not, worked for a bit, but it hasn't really stood up to all the changes and the pressures. And indeed, it wouldn't actually take all that much to modify things, either in our own country, in the UK, or in the US, or in the 50 or more so-called Westminster model democracies around the world, which include Canada and India and Australia and New Zealand and so on. It wouldn't take very much to modify them so that they are constitutionally more capable of doing what democracy should do. And that is to translate the interests that people have into the interests of the people, into what is the best interests of the people. to direct government to what it should be, which is a service to the interests of the people, and not a vehicle for factions and parties and individuals to exercise their preferences and choices on the basis very often of a minority of the population as a whole. So it really is the question of recognizing that the self-congratulatory idea of the democracy that's developed out of the 19th and into the 20th centuries are still in the form in which they currently exist, no longer in need of reform, because they very much are. Now, I'm not with those people who say, oh, well, let's get rid of democracy and let's have something else. Let's hope for benign or autocracy or something. No, not at all. I think that fundamental principle of the consent of the people is far too important. But I also think that by itself, it's not enough. I mean, you'll remember chapter 8 of book 8, rather, of Plato's Republic and all his animadversions against the fact that individuals among the people are too short-term and too selfish and self-interested and all the rest of it to really jointly be able to come up with an overall good policy. Wasn't it H.L. Mencken who said, the dream of democracy is to get collective wisdom out of individual ignorance, or something like that? Well, the way you deal with it is by having a good constitutional structure. That takes thought, that takes design, that needs inbuilt flexibility, not to respond to fashion or emergency, but a well-considered and mature-minded way of moving with the movements of history. And in this way, preserving that ideal, which is that government is the service of the people. And the interests of the people as a whole, and the way they match to the interests that individual people have in a society, is a very key matter. Any society is always in negotiation with itself about its direction of travel, about what's accepted and not accepted, acceptable and not acceptable, and so on. And the negotiation means that a society is a kind of constantly pullulating mass of debate and disagreement. Democracy is noisy, tyranny is silent, because nobody's having that conversation. There's only one person who can speak. So we have to accept that, and we've got to find ways of so adjusting things that people can talk to one another sensibly and maturely, without falling into all these mutually hating silos of opposition, which, alas, is what has happened with the woke wars, because of the frustration that people feel who are fighting against discrimination and finding the doors barred against them and the windows shut and people being deaf. And on the other side, people so hanging on to their interests, their privileges and their profits, that they don't want to listen to this fundamental claim, which is the claim, treat me as a human being. Treat me as an individual on a par with every other, which is at bottom is what the whole woke thing is.
And are you hopeful looking around for the future? Because I mean, to me, I might just be naturally gloomy, but it almost seems hopeless. So whenever you look at the news, everything that's happening in the US in particular, it's very easy to fall into pessimism.
And I always take the view that there is no option to optimism other than getting to the top of a very high building and jumping off. Because if you really were pessimistic really, really pessimistic about things, then there isn't any point in fighting. There's no point in going on. I suppose you could curl up in a ball and get into a corner and suck your thumb. I don't know. There are strategies. But it is worth fighting, because it seems to me, at any rate, that the overall arc of history, to use that phrase, that does tend in a somewhat better direction since the 18th century. Did a lot of steps back with all the steps forward, that's true, and we're witnessing one right now. But in the midst of witnessing it right now, we're also witnessing the way that it blows up in people's faces. I mean, the Trump tariffs fiasco is a brilliant example of this. I mean, it really has blown up in his face and done the United States a lot of damage, weakened it, given comfort to his enemies. I mean, the people who are most delighted by what Trump is doing sit in Moscow, and this is a very bad bad sign. And there are plenty of us, I hope, and I hope I'm using the word us here advisedly, who don't want to put up with it and are thinking about all sorts of different ways that even in the smallest and most local um, situations in which we find an opportunity to resist, that we will resist, that we will be woke. You know, we will wake up not just to the social issues that wokeism deals with, but to the political issues, the constitutional issues, the military issues. The fact that this is a world where, I mean, think of it, where there are people who make billions of dollars a year out of seeing their preferred kind of conflict happening in the world. That's the kind of conflict which is very difficult to resolve and drags on and on and on and needs a continual resupply of weapons and ammunition. You know, it's just horrible to think that's, you know, no profit without war sort of idea, or indeed the fact that pretty well every boundary on the planet, every national border was drawn in the blood of wars. You know, the thing is that humanity is still at an infantile stage. We still do things as if we were children in a kindergarten quarreling over the toys, and we haven't really sort of got anywhere. And there are a number. Well, I mean, sorry, we have got quite a long way, but we haven't got far enough on these very, very big and very important issues. And they're all the more important, by the way, because humanity stands trembling on the bridge if the bridge doesn't collapse under us, courtesy of Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin and so on. But we're standing at the beginning of a bridge which will take humanity into space. You know, the next big chapter in the human story is colonization of the moon and maybe even Mars. It all sounds very science fiction at the moment, but it's happening. It's on the way. Hundreds of billions of dollars are being invested on mining on the moon and establishing bases on the moon. People are flying there all the time now. And that would be a staging post onwards to Mars. And it was as long ago as the 1930s that, in fact, a Russian lawyer who was thinking about the rights to airspace and the rights to space, who speculated on the fact that if there is some inevitability in the expansion of humanity into the near part of the solar system, and if colonies are established on the moon and Mars, then the dynamic of history tells us that in the medium or far future, those colonies will want to be independent of Earth. Well, then, I mean, H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds comes into view, and you think, what do we want to do now that would ensure that the future is a humane one and doesn't merely replicate all the rivalry, competition and conflict and war and injustice and so on that we've been struggling with on our own planet? You know, so if you've got a big imagination and you think far into the future and you say to yourself, well, you know, we'd like to plant these seeds in the right way. We would like those future chapters of humanity to be much, much more peaceful, more productive, more humane future. Then we can ask ourselves, well, why the heck don't we start doing it right here and right now? And one of the ways that we do that is by listening to people who say, I want a fair shot. I just want to be part of this society. I want to be seen. I want to be recognized. And I don't want people slamming doors in my face because they don't like the color of my skin or my sex or my sexuality or my disability.
Do you know it's a book I read a few years ago, The Precipice by Toby Ord.
I don't know, no, but
I think it talks a lot about that sort of long-term thinking about how to do things now to ensure a brighter future. Which it just reminded me of that. It's a very good book. Yeah, I mean, I think one of our problems, and you mention it in Discriminations, is that we tend to focus very much on relatively small issues. I think you mentioned the gender sex issue, which is a relatively tiny issue compared to, say, climate change. And yes, we seem to spend a hell of a lot of time on it.
But there's a reason for it, Daniel, if I may jump in. And I know I'm talking too much, but the thing is that the transgender issue is a really feels to the people on the right, on the conservative side of this, an easy target. Because it's easy to appeal to prejudices about binaries and so on, and to mock the sorts of things that are said by some activists on the transgender issue. They're an easy, vulnerable, fragile target. And by ridiculing them or mocking them or attacking them, you can generalize that to all those other causes. I mean, think of somebody on the right now trying to do the same thing with, say, racism or sexism as overtly as they do about the transgender issue. So, I mean, that's one main reason why that is the case, even though, what is it, 1.7% of the world's population as a whole doesn't feel that they fit comfortably into one or other of the traditional binaries, okay? But there is a second reason, which is that actually the transgender issue, which for people who are, I mean, really, sort of engaged with all the sincerity of their being in feeling that they aren't what they were assigned to be at birth, and who want to live a different way, and who identify with a form of being and wishing to be accepted as such and so on. I mean, people like that, if only one were to have a really generous and sympathetic attitude towards it, there would be none of this mockery and this attack that you see coming from the right. But in the midst of all that, there are one or two very tricky issues, and the trickiest issue, I suppose, is the women's spaces issue. There's a lot of women who push back against, say, trans women. It doesn't work. It's not a problem the other way around so much, but certainly in the case of trans women. Well, there are solutions to the women's spaces issue. So women's washrooms and women's prisons and women's changing rooms. The way to deal with it is just, every washroom, every changing space, every prison, the facilities are such that nobody ever comes into any kind of embarrassing contact with anybody else, so you can solve that. Women's sports. Now, there's a very difficult one. I must say, I do find it hard. And I think if one's honest about it, it's very hard to think of how to deal with this exactly. Because, as is the case with all ethical dilemmas, the arguments on both sides are very powerful. You don't have a dilemma if one side of the argument is just cut and dried and the other one is no good. But if there are real issues on both sides that you want to respect, it is hard to see how to deal with it. And I find that a very difficult issue. And of course, it's the one, therefore, that anti-wokists will pounce on, because it's the one where there is this particular difficulty. And my thought is that the people who should solve this are the people involved themselves. I mean, if it were possible for the people who are fully engaged themselves to try to work out how to do this, not for us on the outside, not for an old white privileged male to be pontificating about how to solve that particular problem, other than by saying, look at what's at issue here, and see what's very fundamental, and then just see if there is some way that with calmness and with goodwill and with rationality, you could find a way forward.
Do you have any views on, well, I suppose some of your, because this issue has split so many people down the middle. I mean, some of your old new atheist colleagues, for example, Richard Dawkins, is now very vocal on sex and gender issues. Jerry Coyne, Steven Pinker, they had a big fracas with the Freedom from Religion Foundation back in December over this issue. Yeah, is there a split there in the, I don't want to say atheist movement, but grouping?
Well, look, there will be differences of view. People are sort of entitled in a way to debate these matters, obviously, and perhaps to disagree. I'm very sorry indeed to see that a disagreement has to take the form of a split and people, getting into rival camps and having a standoff with one another. It's a pity that it goes in that direction. I suppose it's kind of inevitable in a way that a biologist, might think in terms of binaries, since almost everything in nature falls into binaries from the point of view of explanatory theory, at any rate, about how they evolve and work and so on. So when a conflict arises between perceptions molded by a particular science, genetics or what are other biological sciences on the one hand, and on the other hand, an attempt to recognize great and important social issues of our day, which changes and movements and evolutions in society have thrown up as important issues. That is exactly the point, I think, at which people should step back and be calm and say, well, okay, well, let's have a look at the differences, see if we can't resolve them, and if we can't, agree to differ.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the issue I think that a lot of people have with this question is they see, especially people like biologists like Coyne and Dawkins, is they see a kind of ideological subversion of science and journals stating that sex isn't binary, for example, and they disagree with that. It's kind of like the controversy in New Zealand, which Richard Dawkins was also involved in, over indigenous ways of knowing, and he got a lot of flack for opposing that. So yeah, I think they're coming at it from their perspective, but yeah, it's a difficult one.
Well, again, in the ideal, so we're talking utopian here. By the way, I must apologize for just sneezing there. I hope it didn't disrupt the audio too much. I'm afraid it being springtime, it tends to make one sneeze. The issue here is the kind and degree of evidence, how it's applied, and what consequences there are for social questions. So, this is where what one would like to see is some kind of collegial endeavor to clarify the issues properly and to see what work these different frameworks of concepts do. I mean, after all, the framework of concepts in biology about sexual reproduction requires a binary, obviously. And if you export that into thinking about the way that roles in society are socially constructed, and try to argue that the one has to parallel the other. Both sides, in fact, are a little tempted to say this. The biologist saying the sociologist must conform to biological categories and vice versa. We might be missing a point, because it might, after all, be that we need to accept that there are internally consistent and well-justified paroles or languages, conceptual schemes that work very well when we're trying to organize our thinking about one set of phenomena, and don't work well when they organize another set of phenomena. The thought that there should be a smooth reduction of all discourses, of all conceptual schemes into one fundamental scheme might be something that misleads us. It might also, by the way, be true, but at the same time, it might be that it's misleading us. My own intuition, and here I'm thinking in more sort of technical philosophical terms about matters of metaphysics and epistemology here, is that we don't get smooth reductions from one way of thinking about things. For example, talking about psychological concepts to talking about, let's just say, neurological ones, or neurological ones, so talking about atomic ones, that there are kinds of properties that apply to phenomena at different levels of organization that can't be predicted easily from what we say when we talk about low levels of organization. So, I mean, this is to get into the weeds a little bit about how we think of these different ways of thinking and talking. But it might very well be that the framework of biology doesn't sit as neatly as people would sometimes like with the kinds of ways that we sort and think about roles, social roles, and what people do and how they perceive one another and how they present one another in society.
Yeah, I think yeah, I think they struggle sometimes with with saying we are talking about the biological level, which doesn't make us transphobic. But to a lot of people, they see their very act of talking in that way as being transphobic. So it's again, it's the gender issue really is one of those. Somehow it's become such a toxic issue on so many levels. But as you say, there are actually some pretty rational solutions, and we should probably focus on those.
Yeah, so I mean, I remember when I was a young man, first getting to know France, um, being a little surprised, but not troubled by the fact that the washrooms, the loos in France at that time were sort of completely unisex. You might be standing at at the cubicle having a pee, and a woman will walk in, pass behind you, and go into one of the closets. And admittedly, the very first time it happens, you do tend to splash your boots a bit. But after that, you just sort of take it for granted, and it's not a problem. Nobody minds. It's changed here since then. Actually, it changed to having, Damen and Herren, the ladies and gents separate loos. Now it's coming back again to unisex loos, but in the form of separate cubicles, separate closets, which is a sensible way of doing things. I think this is happening in the UK as well, probably happening in a lot of places. That solves that problem. So that does that. Changing rooms in a gym, well, that's a different matter. But there you really do have to just make the facilities available. It's a matter of cost rather than of conceptual complication to find ways of having separate individual changing closets for men and women. The sports issue, as I said earlier, that is a very much more difficult one. And this argument over categories and concepts and binaries and biology and gender and social construction, and I mean, now there is an issue where the fur flies, yes, indeed. But as both you and I, as you pointed out earlier on, this is an issue which, in fact, speaks to a small number of people. Not that that means that for any one of those people, it's not important. It's hugely important. And we really have to, again, thinking generously and sympathetically about these matters, we have to take that very seriously. But in the scheme of things, climate change is massive. That affects absolutely everybody. Racism and sexism, well, racism, in fact, as felt by white Westerners towards, or as might be felt by some white Westerners towards anybody who isn't a white Westerner, that's a serious problem. Sexism, but that's half of humanity. That's a very serious problem. Homophobia, that's an ugly thing, and it doesn't respect anything about human nature and human diversity and history, or the individual. I mean, after all, individual human rights are about us as individual units, as people with feelings, desires, ambitions, emotions, who want to be able to step out into the public square and be accepted there.
I'll just finish off with a couple of questions. One I just wanted to briefly touch on is this on a bit of another subject, but this so-called new theism, which is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. I write about it a lot and speak about it a lot. This sort of resurgence of religion, that we need a Christian foundation for Western civilization. against its enemies, such as wokeism is typically one of those enemies. And I think you've spoken a little bit about this new theism phenomenon as well. So I don't know if you wanted to just say a couple of words about that.
Well, there's nothing new about theism any more than there ever was anything new about the so-called new atheism. The thing is this persistent thorn lodged in the cerebral cortices of so many people in the world. The desire, the wish to translate whatever anxieties, desires, fears, superstitious impulses they have into some story about, supernatural agencies in the universe and our relationship with them. That's a kind of perennial, in a way, of the human story itself. So whatever new set of cassocks it dresses itself up in, it not all that new. But it's a way of polishing up the weapons in a way of trying to provide some kind of justification for a lot of old and very unpleasant discriminatory and prejudicial attitudes. And also, of course, it's a way of trying to reassert control. It's always been the case that if you can say to somebody, there's an invisible policeman who watches everything you do, even when you're on your own in the dark, and you will eventually be called to account for it. This is a very, very useful means of asserting social control over people, of governing the impulses that the people who are keen on this are themselves afraid of. Moralizers, which is what ultimately, of course, religious control over society is inspired by. Moralism is, I don't like it, so you mustn't do it. I'm frightened of it, therefore you're not allowed to look at it. All that kind of attitude. And it's, again, digging into the foundations of these things, one finds that the basis of this way of thinking is simply unacceptable. It's an infringement on the liberty of thought of each individual and the liberty to choose how to see things. We're all free to do that. What we're not free to do is to impose it on others. And always, every religion one can think of, with the possible exception of one, and that is Judaism, has worked hard to try to convert or impose their way of seeing things on everybody else.
Yeah, well, as you said, it's there's nothing new about it, and it's kind of like the woke wars, the culture wars, in that sense that we have these cycles that these things pop up in new forms all the time, and perhaps the whole religion debate is not unrelated to the culture war cycle. But yeah, just to finish off, then going back to the book, do you have any hopes for its impact? What impact do you hope it will have?
Well, of course, the hope I have is that everybody interested or concerned or involved will read it and then put it down at the end and say, yes, he's right. We're all going to be jolly good, chaps now. And we're going to be peaceful and we're going to respect everybody else's human rights, and we're going to stop, saying hateful things like the white supremacists and the misogynists do, or try to be the only ones who are allowed to say things and so on. That would be ideal. Yes, that's naturally what I hope. I don't expect it. But what I do more modestly hope, I suppose, is that it would be seen as a constructive way of suggesting, given that we get the question right here, what sorts of answers might work if we were willing enough to try to make them work.
I think that's a good place to leave it. So thanks very much again for giving me some of your time. And yeah, but I've read the book as well, so I hope it has the impact that you want it to have.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for having me on. I enjoyed it.